It's astounding how powerful this unconditional love is. I want to tell you a story as you think about this force and picturing and putting yourself in a perspective of unconditional love, which is an absence of judgment, an absence of anger, an absence of telling yourself that someone ought to be like you. And I want to tell you how it has worked for me. One of the things I have known in my life in recent years is that it's important for me to get my ego out of what I do and how to go about doing that, which is to take my attention off of the outcome and what's in it for me and how much I'm going to get and put it more on serving and stop being so concerned with how much comes to me and how much approval I get and how much money I get and all of the things like that, and to just stay more centered on what it is I'm about. And I picked up a story last Christmas morning, a newspaper, and my daughter Tracy and my wife Marceline were there, and I read this story, and the story said, woman spends her 27th year in a coma. And I read this story, and it was a story of a woman named Kay O'Bara and her daughter Edwarda O'Bara. The story went on to say that in 1970, on January the 3rd, this young girl who was 16 years of age slipped into a diabetic coma at about 4 o'clock in the morning. She had been given oral insulin as an adolescent, and it was called diabetes, and it wasn't metabolizing with her, and she wasn't getting the insulin. It wasn't going into her bloodstream. And she woke up in this, she was just shaking and in great, great pain, and they rushed her to the hospital. And as she was on the hospital bed, her mother went there with her in 1970. Edwarda, the young girl, who was a senior in high school at the time, said to her mom, "Mom, you won't leave me, will you, Mommy?" And she had never called her Mommy before. She had always called her Mom or Mother. And Kay said to her, "I will never leave you, I promise. And a promise is a promise." And that was in 1970. Well, 27 years later, Kay has been feeding Edwarda every 2 hours for 27 years. Imagine yourself never being able to sleep in a bed for 27 years. At 2 a.m., 4 a.m., 6 a.m., 8 a.m., getting up every night, sleeping in a chair next to your daughter. Imagine yourself never going to a mall or going to a movie. And imagine yourself being drained financially by medical bills alone that number now $3,000 a month just for the medication, with an income of $1,100 a month. And imagine yourself also every 4 hours, 24 hours a day, 6 times a day, having to take a blood sugar reading and then administer insulin based upon the reading, 6 times every day. And imagine yourself coming home from that hospital bed. This woman was a school teacher, a mathematics teacher and physics teacher down in Miami. And she came home 4 months after the onslaught of the coma because they no longer could afford to stay in the hospital. Their insurance had run out long ago. They were now borrowing money. And then imagine 4 years later, the husband having a conversation with you, saying, "I can no longer stand to see myself standing by, watching, while our finances are drained, and I can't do anything for my daughter. I'm going to go to heaven and work from there." And the next day, dying of a massive heart attack at the age of 49. And then when that happened, the other daughter, Edwarda's sister, becoming a crack cocaine addict and living on the street and having her only little baby being raised by Kay as well. Losing your husband, your daughter to a coma, your other daughter to the streets, and still every 2 hours, 24 hours a day, 27 years, feeding and taking care of this child. This is the story of Kay O'Bara. And I read that story and I was astounded by this kind of unconditional love. And I said to Tracy over and over again, I said, I just can't fathom how somebody could take a quarter of a century and more and have this kind of devotion. And I took a copy of one of the books I wrote a couple of years back called Real Magic, which is a book about miracles. And I wrote in that book, "You are my hero." And I sent Kay a check. I thought that I was then done with it, it was a very touching story, but it was still sort of tugged at my heartstrings. And I went away in January to write this Manifest Your Destiny book. And while I was there, I turned on the TV for the only time I had it on while I was there one evening, after I had completed writing about unconditional love. This principle that I'm sharing with you here. And on the TV, there was a show called Inside Edition, and Deborah Norville was the hostess, and she came on and said, and I know Deborah, I've been on the air with her, and I admired her a great deal, and she said there's going to be someone on the show that's very special later, a mother whose daughter's been in a coma for almost 27 years. You'll want to stay tuned. And I thought, wow, that could only be the lady, because I didn't even remember her name that I had written to back at Christmas. And sure enough, they open up the TV show with her reading to Eduarda from Real Magic that I had sent to her. And I thought, something is happening here. Something is happening here. And I thought, when I get home, I am going to look up that woman and find out if I can get her phone number and maybe call her and see if there's anything more that I can do, because I was so touched by that. And when I got home in February, after writing, picked up my mail, and I had a huge stack of mail, and on the top of the mail stack was a letter from Kay O'Bara thanking me for the check I had sent and for the book, and asking me if I would please come down. Well, my wife and I went down to see Kay and Eduarda. And when we went to Kay's house down in Miami, about 40 miles from our home, walked into Eduarda's room, a room filled with angels and relics and all kinds of spiritual literature and music, and it was like we knew we were in a holy place. And as I talked to Kay and told her how touched I was by her unconditional love, her display of unconditional love, I had to fly away a couple of days later and go out to the West Coast of California, out into California. I had to do a show out there, a politically incorrect show. And I did the show, and when I was coming back after doing the show, my wife called and she said, Oprah Winfrey is going to be taping a show on people in comas, and they would like you to be at her home tomorrow if that's possible. And I said, well, I'm not flying back till tomorrow. She said, well, maybe you could fly on the all-nighter, the red-eye, and get in the morning. And I said, all right, I'll do it. And I flew home, and I went there, and they taped during the day. They came to her home. And while I was there, I talked a little bit about who I believed this person to be, who was doing her holy work from this place. And then the show aired. And the show was about people in comas, but it was focused on this policeman in Tennessee who had been in a coma for 9 years. And then he suddenly awoke, and he just began talking after 9 years, and it was considered to be a miracle. And they had his brother and some other people on the show. And then they had some other people who had been in a coma but had come back, but they weren't the same as they were before the coma. And the focus of the show was mostly on how tough it was, what a struggle this was, and it's not easy on the rest of the family, and so on. And then Kay came on the show. And Kay is the most uplifting and dynamic and positive and joyful person. And she said, this is not a chore. This is an honor. And when she was asked, well, why do you do this? She said, well, God asked me to do it. And God never gives you any more than you can handle. She said, I only asked for 2 daughters. I didn't ask for them to be anything special, anything unique. I just asked for 2 daughters. And I take care of her, and I am honored to serve her in this way. And she is fed through a tube. She has brain activity. She was 27 years ago in what is called a stage 1 coma, which is one in which they had to tape her eyes shut because her coma was so deep. And today, more than a quarter of a century later, when I had my other children come down and sing to her, and Serena sat up there on the bed with her and held her hand. This was Easter Sunday, and I said, we have to go now. Grandma's coming over, and we have to get home now. And she turned her head, and a tear came down her eye. And the last time that I was in her presence, which was not more than a few days ago, when I walked in after having been gone during the summer, she smiled in recognition. She's in what is now called a stage 9 coma. Whether she's coming out or not, we don't know. But 5 years ago, Kay told me what happened in confidence. She said, it was 1991, and it was in October, and I woke up to give her 4 o'clock feeding, because she only sleeps for 45 minutes at a time, in a chair. And she said there was a bright light in the room. And I thought someone was there to harm Eduarda, because people have driven by her home and shot bullet holes into their walls saying, we're going to put her out of her misery. There's that kind of consciousness that is out there. And one interviewer said, isn't your daughter a vegetable? And she said, I've never seen a vegetable smile, have you? So she saw this light back in the room when she was preparing the food to go into the tube that feeds her. And she walked back there very quickly, and there, standing at the foot of the bed, was an apparition whom she later identified as the Blessed Mother, Virgin Mary. And she began to talk after her initial fear and was told that your daughter is a blessed one. And she said, well, why is she in a coma? And Kay told me that the Blessed Mother had told her that your daughter is a victim soul, and you'll have to find out what that means yourself, so you'll know. And she called the different priests in the different places in the Catholic Church hierarchy, and none of them had ever heard of that. And then she called a cardinal, and the cardinal said, where did you hear this term? And she said, well, I'd really rather not say, because she didn't want to be perceived as being nutsy and crazy and so on, talking to ghosts. And the cardinal said, well, this is a term that goes back to antiquity. And a victim soul is someone who deliberately takes on suffering as their purpose in being here, in order to teach compassion or to teach love or to teach peace. Very much like Gandhi did during the rioting in the 30s and 40s, when he would fast to the point of dying, as long as there was some violence. And he was willing to take that on, rather than to allow that to continue. And we all know, of course, of the great tradition of Christianity, of taking on suffering, so that the rest of us might be freer people. And when I interviewed Kay about Eduarda, I asked her what was Eduarda like, and I asked her classmates, and I asked her sister and her relatives, and everyone that I asked said the same thing, that Eduarda was like a saint when she was a little girl. If she saw someone who was hungry, she would give them her allowance. If she saw someone who was cold, she would take her sweater off and give it to them. She studied the saints, carried books about the saints with her wherever she went. She didn't know how to judge anyone. And I went home, and I was doing my meditation, and I thought, what can I do? What is the message here? Why am I so attracted to this? And in my meditation, I said, I'm going to write her story. And I'm not going to take any money for it. Just like I appeared on Oprah with her for the first time when there was nothing in it for Wayne Dyer. And even though I was only on a minute or so of that show, it was one of the most fulfilling things I'd ever done. Because I knew it wasn't for my own ego, but in the name of serving. And I called Kay and I said, I would like to write your story. And I'll donate all the royalties to you, to the Eduarda Obera Fund. And we'll sell 1 million of these. And we'll get you out of debt, because she has this onus of debt around her neck. $300 and some thousand worth. What she has done is made baked goods and has done cookbooks and has done celebrity auctions and has borrowed from here, has had 35 to 37 different credit cards going at one time and having to borrow from loan sharks and being threatened, all just to keep this thing going, because there's been no other way to make it work. And her debts are huge. I said, I know I can remove that. And she said, you know, Doc, it's funny that you called, because the Blessed Mother said that the right angel would show up and would tell the story with dignity, the way it needs to be told. I said, well, the only thing I can say, Kay, is that I have to tell the whole story. your fear of what others might think when I talk about your speaking to apparitions and so on has to be dissipated. She said, I trust you completely. Tell it as you will. And this is the result. It's called A Promise is a Promise. An almost unbelievable story of a mother's unconditional love and what it can teach us. And I asked my wife, my dear wife, who has birthed 7 children, to write a mother's perspective. And she wrote a beautiful chapter in here. And we also included photographs of Kay and Eduarda before the coma and after. And in my heart, I believe this is unconditional love in action. Very much like Mother Teresa sees Jesus Christ in all of his distressing disguises, I believe that Kay's work with Eduarda teaches us about a full measure of unconditional love. And that Eduarda made the choice, as the Blessed Mother told her. When Kay said, well, did she have a choice to do this? And she said, absolutely. And she's teaching compassion. And as I speak about it here, and as I speak about it on these tapes, and people listen to it, and people go out and purchase this book, and the money goes to Kay and Eduarda, I believe that what is happening is that she is teaching us compassion, which is the cornerstone of unconditional love. And she's doing her work through me, through you who are listening, for those of you who purchase A Promise is a Promise, and give it away as gifts to others who have demonstrated unconditional love. As Kay says, it's not if she will wake up, but when there's enough compassion in the world, her work will be completed, and she will either awaken or God will take her with her. And that's unconditional love. There's no better example of it that I know. Thank you very much.